Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something a little different today. It's about language learning and, get this, the U.S. housing market.
Yeah, you wouldn't think those two would go together, right?
Not at all, but trust me, it gets really interesting. Our source is a YouTube video about a woman learning English, and she ends up revealing a lot about what it takes to buy a house in America.
I'm intrigued. I always say sometimes the most unexpected places have the best insights.
Totally.
Yeah.
So she starts by talking about how learning English is like opening all these doors for her.
Yeah.
Which I guess kind of relates to how buying a house is seen as this big step in life, right?
Yeah, I see the connection. Both are about expanding your horizons, sort of leveling up.
Exactly. And she's not just talking classroom English, she's focused on the practical side of things. She mentions this technique called shadowing that she uses.
Oh, interesting.
I have to admit, I was clueless. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, it's pretty common among language learners. You basically mimic a native speaker, repeat everything you hear to get your pronunciation and fluency down. It's like athletes studying game film.
Oh,
Yeah.
so it's not just about understanding the words, but how they're actually spoken. Makes sense.
Exactly. It trains your ear and your mouth to work together, basically.
I could see how that would be super helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get to her housing journey. She starts with renting, which in the U.S. seems pretty different from other places, wouldn't you say?
For sure. She mentions that sometimes with smaller landlords, there's no formal application process, which can be a risk, honestly.
Yeah, it sounds kind of informal.
In the US, usually it's a lot stricter. Like they do credit checks, background checks, the whole 9 yards. It's supposed to protect both the landlord and the tenant, but of course there are always exceptions.
Makes sense. And then, of course, there's the down payment issue. She talks about how that's a huge hurdle for people wanting to buy a house. Can you break that down for us a bit?
Sure. Basically, in the US, you usually need to pay a big chunk of money up front, like 20% of the house price, before you can even get a mortgage.
Wow, 20%. That's a lot.
It is. It helps lenders reduce their risk, but yeah, it definitely makes it harder to buy, especially for first-timers.
And house prices in the U.S. are all over the place, right?
All right.
She mentioned seeing everything from $150,000 places to, like, multi-million-dollar mansions.
Yeah, it's a wide range. So imagine trying to save 20% on $1 million house.
Yeah, that's way out of reach for most people. It's no wonder she talks about real estate agents being involved in almost every house purchase. She even throws out a stat that blew my mind. 98% of home purchases in the U.S. go through a realtor.
Wow, that's a lot. In many other countries, people buy and sell directly, but the US system really relies on realtors.
So they're basically guiding you through this whole process.
Yeah. They act as a go-between, negotiating for their clients and handling all the legal and financial stuff.
I guess that makes sense, given how complicated it all sounds. She mentions her realtor was calling her, like, every single day. That's a lot of hand-holding.
It can be pretty intense, especially when you're getting close to closing the deal. Realtors have a ton to do. Working with the mortgage lenders, setting up inspections, handling paperwork. It's a lot to juggle.
I can only imagine. But it sounds like they earn their money. Speaking of which, she mentions realtors taking a big cut. What's the deal with that?
Right, so realtors work on commission. So instead of getting paid by the hour, they get a percentage of the sale price, usually around 6%.
6%, that's huge. Did the buyer have to pay all that?
Not usually. Typically, it's the seller who covers the realtor fees. They just factor it into the asking price.
So she didn't have to pay anything extra for a realtor. That's actually pretty good.
It can be a big advantage for buyers, for sure, especially if you're already struggling with that down payment.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from learning English to the ins and outs of renting and buying in the U.S. What's next on our deep dive agenda?
Well, she also goes into the whole moving process itself, packing, movers, all those little challenges. Ready to unpack that?
Let's get into it. So she actually seems pretty organized about the whole thing.
Yeah, she talks about getting boxes for free from like grocery stores and starting to pack weeks ahead of time.
That's smart. I'm definitely the kind of person who leaves it all to the last minute.
I think a lot of us are. It's a huge task, moving, but breaking it down into smaller chunks definitely helps.
Oh, for sure. Less overwhelming that way.
Yeah, definitely. And then when it came to like the actual heavy lifting, she decided to hire movers.
Yeah, I mean, she was pregnant at the time, so it makes sense that she wouldn't want to risk anything.
Of course.
Yeah.
But even without that, moving furniture is tough.
Oh, yeah, totally.
It's a good thing those movers exist. They have the equipment and know how to get it done safely.
And speaking of the movers, she tells this hilarious story about them showing up with a truck that was, like, way too big for her street.
Oh, I remember that.
It was downtown, right?
Yeah.
Narrow streets, nowhere to park.
Yeah, they had to park blocks away in the end and carry the couch what felt like a mile.
It's funny now, but I bet it was super stressful at the time.
I know. Proof that even with the best planning, moving can throw you curveballs.
Exactly. But hey, at least she didn't have to lift a finger. Literally.
Exactly. Sometimes it's worth it to get some help, you know? Saves you stress and potential back pain.
Totally agree. So we've covered a lot, from learning English and personal growth to navigating the U.S. housing market and, well, the reality of actually moving. What would you say are the main takeaways for our listeners today?
Well, I think one big thing is that even when going through major life changes, there are always chances to learn and grow.
Yeah, like even just this woman's story. She's learning a new language, figuring out a new housing market. It's a lot, but she's taking it all in.
Exactly. And I think it shows that you don't have to have it all figured out to take those leaps, you know?
Absolutely. And when it comes to the U.S. housing market specifically, well, it's complicated. We've seen how realtors play a huge role, how down payments are a major factor. It's a whole system to learn.
Definitely. If you're thinking about buying a house in the US, do your research. Knowledge is power in this game.
Couldn't agree more. And then, of course, there's the whole moving process itself. Plan ahead, get organized, ask for help when you need it.
Yeah, and try to find the humor in those inevitable bumps along the way. It's all part of the adventure.
I love that. So as we wrap this up, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. Knowing what we know now about the current market and how tricky buying a house can be, would you choose to buy a house? Or would you maybe explore different ways to create your ideal living space?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's a big decision with no one right answer.
Right. It all depends on what you value and what fits your lifestyle.
Exactly. Home is more than just bricks and mortar, right? It's about how you feel in a space.
Ooh, that's a good point. So maybe home is less about owning a specific building and more about a feeling.
That's interesting. A sense of belonging, comfort. Those are things you can find in different ways, right?
It's true. You could rent a cool place that gives you more freedom,
Right.
or maybe try one of those co-living things that are getting popular.
Right. There are so many options out there. I think it's amazing that we have the power to decide what home really means for us, you know?
Absolutely. It doesn't have to fit into this one mold. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We've covered a lot, from learning English to the crazy U.S. housing market and even what home really means.
It's been a great conversation. I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to, keep learning and exploring and creating a life that feels like home, wherever that may be.
Well said. And if you're thinking about making a big move, or any big change, really, remember to do your research, plan ahead, and don't be afraid to ask for a little help along the way.
Yeah, and most importantly, have fun with it. It's all part of the journey, right?
Exactly. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.
See you then.